Introducing Senator Klobuchar tonight is Natasha Hill. Tasha is a junior majoring in global resource systems with a certificate in leadership studies. An intersectional feminist, Tasha has a passion for activism with the goal of making the campus inclusive for all students. She's been involved with the Carrie Chapman Cat Center since her first year at Iowa State because she was inspired by our mission, which is to interest, educate, and engage citizens, especially young people and women, in the political process. In summer 2015, Tasha traveled to Sweden as part of the Center's Global Leadership Study Abroad program. She was one of 20 students selected from 100 applicants for the 2016-17 cohort of the Vermeer International Leadership Program. Tasha also serves as one of 2 student members of the Leadership Studies Advisory Board. She is a George Washington Carver Scholar, and this semester, we're delighted to have Tasha working with us at the Cat Center in the Leadership Studies program as a student intern for the Leadership Studies program as part of a grant to enhance the diversity components of our core leadership course. Please join me in welcoming Tasha Hill to the stage.
One of my most beloved writers, Maya Angelou, once said, "If you don't like something, change it." And while I've gained so much wisdom and comfort in her writing, no quote has ever seemed so simple yet so complicated to me. I have learned from my experience as a young Black woman that nothing is ever that easy. She makes it sound like if you want to be more fit, go for a run in the morning. Try telling that to me when the alarm is going off at 6 a.m. and the air outside my comforter is negative 23 degrees. It's not easy. Change is not easy. It's complicated. But some are naturally inclined to change, attuned to its transformations, and dedicated towards guiding it in the right direction and shaping the outcome for the betterment of humanity. As the first woman elected to represent Minnesota in 2006, U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar is one of those people. Putting partisanship aside, Senator Klobuchar has fostered healthy change for America in many ways. She has worked with both Democrats and Republicans to pass notable pieces of legislation to end human trafficking, broaden opportunities in education and careers for returning service members, authored legislation to lift the trade embargo in Cuba, as well as legislation to help small businesses access new markets abroad, and has even passed a landmark amendment to boost funds in STEM education for American students. Currently, Senator Klobuchar serves on the U.S. Senate's Judiciary Committee, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. She is also the ranking member of the Senate Rules and Administration Committee, the Joint Economic Committee, and the Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights. And she has not done all of this unnoticed. Named the American Prospects Woman to Watch, Senator Klobuchar has received national recognition. She received an award from the Service Women's Action Network for her work fighting sexual assault in the military, and the Disabled American Veterans honored her work to improve the lives of America's veterans. The list goes on and on. Now more than ever is a time for change. And when more women run for elected positions, the type of change we need is possible. Please join me in welcoming the woman who ran and got elected, my home state senator, Amy Klobuchar.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. This is an incredible crowd. It's almost as many people as at the Minnesota State Fair. Huh? Almost. It is just great to be here at Iowa State, and I've had so much fun meeting the students like Natasha, and just seeing their enormous potential and their dreams, and it just kind of grounds you at a time where things aren't just that easy in my job. And so thank you so much. And I want to thank Diane for her great leadership and getting everything done here, and her wonderful team, and also everyone else involved in planning this. So thank you very much. I did want to just start by mentioning what's happening in Houston, and our thoughts and prayers are with the people there. That story today that I read of that mother, I don't know if you saw it, the nurse who kept her 3-year-old alive and then perished herself with that child laying on top of her in the water. It's one that you never forget. And we have had our share of floods in the Midwest in both Iowa and Minnesota. Nothing like this, nothing like a metropolitan area that's the size of New Jersey. But I think it gives us a special place in our heart to understand that we don't turn our back on other parts of the country, that we're one America, and that we will do everything to help Texas. So, thank you. I do bring you greetings from the state of Minnesota, where, in the words of our state's unofficial poet laureate, Garrison Keillor, all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the women in politics are above average. So it is truly good to be here. As you know, our states don't just share a border, and we also share that love, as I mentioned, of butter sculptures. I just left our Princess K of the Milky Way, which I know you got that cow, but we do have 12 butter busts. You know, we have those heads in a revolving refrigerator with the woman in the middle carving all of them. And one little trick I found out, I asked the princesses once what they do with their butter busts when the fair ends. And they said, well, some of us put them in our mom's freezer, but they kind of degrade, you know, the features. And then one of them said, but I bring it to my town's corn feed and people just dig in. Okay, so just a little hint there for you going forward. We also, of course, have our great college football teams. You guys have the Cyclones, and we have a team named after rodents, the Golden Gophers. But to be honest, you do prefer a gopher over a Hawkeye, isn't that right? Okay, all right, yeah. See, there's always, you can get in the rivalry. It's kind of like the Vikings and the Packers. So my speech today is focused on women in politics, but when we're living in this incredible moment in time, and I can't think of a more important place to be than the U.S. Senate right now, I'm also going to talk a bit about some of that, and then I'll take some questions. So I guess I'd start with, let's see, what it's like to be a woman in the U.S. Senate. Well, I'd start by, it's really interesting when your junior senator is Al Franken, okay? So, you know, and it's not that easy. Like when we're in airports outside of Minnesota, there I am, we're walking together, colleagues, and someone comes up and says, do you work with him? I say, well, yes, I do. And then they say, will you take my picture with him? I'm like, okay, yeah. Kind of want to put it on the selfie mode, but I don't. And it actually all culminated in when the two of us got on a flight, a Delta flight coming out of D.C., going to the Twin Cities at night, and it was about half full, but the flight crew was from Atlanta. And we get on the plane, and the flight attendant gets on the microphone and says, everyone, we have celebrities on the plane, Mr. and Mrs. Al Franken. And so the plane's laughing because they all know us. And then finally Al goes, no, ma'am, no. She is actually the other United States Senator from Minnesota. She says, gets the microphone again and says, how cool is this? Husband and wife senators. True story. I actually thought that would be a really good way to start this discussion of women in politics. So, you know, in Iowa, you can't talk about women in politics without talking about Mary Louise Smith. And I'm proud today to give this lecture in her name. It was so fun to learn all about her, getting involved in politics at the grassroots level, serving on the school board, noticing her hard work, and then rising up in Iowa. And then President Ford, after the Watergate scandal, puts her in as the first woman to chair the National Republican Party. And what is really interesting about her is that she just wouldn't back down. She served on the board of Iowa's Planned Parenthood. All right, that's true. She cared about civil rights and women's rights, and whenever people complained about her lack of leadership and called her the little old lady from Iowa, I think she wore that as a badge of honor, as I'm sure many would. And she got to rebuild her party from the precinct level up at that critical time. And you really think back to 1974 when Mary Louise was appointed head of the Republican National Committee. We had back then a controversial president, talk of pardons in the news, and people were afraid that the partisan bickering would never end. Well, thank goodness that would never happen today. So just a few decades before her, to kind of make a jump to Minnesota here, we had our own Mary Louise Smith. It was a Democrat, and her name was Koya Knutson. And she was our first woman member of Congress. And she kind of ran against the whole party as a Democrat, but she ran against their choice and got herself elected in a rural district in 1954. She barnstormed, she drove more than 25,000 miles, sometimes delivering a dozen speeches a day, and against all odds, she won. And by all accounts, she did a great job in Congress. She led the fight for the first federal appropriation for cystic fibrosis. She launched the first federal student loan program, first woman to serve on the House Ag Committee, re-elected in 1956, again against the wishes of the party bosses. And then this happened. Her opponents wanted to finally displace her, so they got her husband drunk. He had a drinking problem, and they got him drunk, and they got him to write a letter that basically said, "Koya, come home, I want you to clean the house." And they sent it to the major newspapers, and it went statewide, and the headline was, "Koya, come home." And then, sadly, she went on to lose her election. And not only did she lose her election, she lost her election to a 6'4" Odin Langen, whose campaign slogan was, "A big man for a man-sized job." So that's why this is so important. We're talking about this stuff today. So I don't think you need to look further from these great women students than we see, or in the U.S. Senate, or the boardroom, to the courtroom, to the State House, to see that we've made some strides for women. More than 40% of mothers right now are the family's main breadwinner. Many of women and many of you in this room have really made incredible historic ground in breaking into the old boys club. Take the Fortune 500. We now have a record 32 women CEOs. It might not sound like a lot, but only in 1995 there weren't any. Think of that. We're making progress in Congress with a record 21 women in the U.S. Senate. But we still have work to do because, the numbers are not nearly high enough. 79 men and 21 women. It reminds me of like a college mixer. It's like a student joke there. And I truly believe we can do better. I don't know what the right number is. I think that if you ask Franken, it would be 99 women and him. But, I think that we have a lot of things to do. So how do we get there? I think we get there by not just dwelling on those numbers, actually, because people don't want to just hear, I know this from my election, oh, we need a woman, oh, we haven't had a woman, oh, we need a woman. I think we need to talk about the impact that the women who are in leadership and whatever job they do have made, and make that case in a very different way. Someone once said that women leaders, I don't agree with part of this, I agree with the second part, but she said, women leaders speak softly and carry a big statistic. And I don't agree with the speak softly, but I think women leaders have tended to run a lot on accountability. 2015 Harvard study, that's the Iowa State of Massachusetts. The study had 3 conclusions. 1, we work harder, the women. The average women's senator passed a lot more, introduced bills, passed more bills. Number 2, we work together. Average women's senator had more than 9 co-sponsors compared to 6 for the men, kind of interesting. And this one be the most important, we support each other. The women supporters, women senators support each other. And I'm not surprised because I've seen it firsthand. It is not easy in Washington in the last 10 years. Probably my lowest moment was the fiscal cliff night where it was New Year's Eve and the whole country was waiting to see what was going to happen with their taxes. The whole thing was just sitting there. We were voting till 3 in the morning. This is a true story. Midnight on New Year's Eve, that magical moment, I found myself on the Senate floor, and I look to my left, I see Harry Reid. I look to my right, I see Mitch McConnell. Every girl's dream on New Year's Eve. And we somehow got through that, and I thought, well, it can't get much worse than this. And then, of course, we had the shutdown. And a little historic note here, you know who was the architect of that shutdown? Ted Cruz. With what's just happened in his home state, I don't think he's going to be doing that again this fall. But who knows? So back then, Republican Senator Susan Collins stood up when we were in the middle of the shutdown and made a plea for people to join her in trying to find a solution. I was the first Democrat that called her. We started a group of 14 of us, half women. We let John McCain in. And we came up with an idea about a week or so later, an agreement between the 14 of us. We actually reserved the press gallery 3 hours later. And then we went to the leadership on both sides and we said, we're going to go out there, the 14 of us, with this agreement unless you do something. 2 hours later, they announced an agreement and we got out of the shutdown. So that is an example where our numbers may be 21 out of 100, but 50% of that group were women. And so I have seen that time and time again, whether it's Senator Stabenow leading the Farm Bill, whether it is Senator Boxer on the transportation bill, Claire McCaskill and Kirsten Gillibrand leading the fight against sexual assault in the military. The Violence Against Women Act, the House bill was pretty bad. It was not good on a bunch of issues, including LGBT and tribal issues. And then at the time, the 20 women in the Senate stood up and said, we won't vote for that bill. Democrat, Republican, we will only vote for this bill, and we passed that bill, and then the House had no choice but to do the stronger bill. So I have seen that time and time again with the women in the Senate. Sometimes it's a bit more amusing, like the time that I was in the women's senator's bathroom after we were at 21 senators, women, and I sent out a tweet that went viral, and it said, for the first time in the history of the United States of America, there is a traffic jam in the women's senator's bathroom. And then after that, Senator Mikulski, then the dean of the women senators, and I started on our own, the Expand the Women's Bathroom Committee. Schumer got us some space in the back. We had a very important meeting with the male Senate architect and his staff, all on one side, Senator Mikulski and I on the other. He gives us the plan, and she looks at me and says, this only adds one stall. This is a bathroom of the present, not the future, not for when we have 50 women senators. And I said, exactly, this is a glass ceiling women's bathroom plan. Needless to say, that was the end of that. We got our way and we have our stalls and we're ready for those 50 women. So, okay. So how do we move ahead? Well, I'd say the first is that we have the women senators. We have dinner almost every month, just the 21 of us. Usually I'd say about 15 people can come on any day, which is pretty incredible for the Senate. And of course, we never talk about the male senators. That kind of camaraderie has made a difference. It's the same camaraderie I've found in the prayer breakfast group, which is like 25 senators. You know, people like Sheldon Whitehouse, half Democrats, half Republicans, about 60, 70 senators talk about their lives every 2 years. They just tell a story, not always religious, but what's said in that room stays in that room. And it's an incredible group to try to understand your colleagues and find them where there is that common ground and that higher ground. And I've found ways to work with everyone. Your two senators here, Joni Ernst and I, actually worked hard on getting the World War II women pilots to be able to be buried at Arlington Cemetery, something they had been denied since World War II, and we got that changed. Chuck Grassley and I have worked together on the renewable fuel standard, which is pretty important for Iowa, and actually a bill to lower prescription drug costs, which I'll mention later. So I just think that you look for that common ground where you can find it. Second thing, as we look at women in politics, is that women have to look out for each other. I'll never forget, and that means trying to encourage each other here at the school, trying to encourage each other to run for office. I'll never forget when I was at my first day in the Senate. I had no idea what I'm doing. I'm in this really fancy lunch place, you know, the LBJ room with this big portrait on, all this nice china. I go over and I get a salad and a cup of soup. I bring it over. I'm ready to dive in, spoon midair, and only Patty Murray, it was all men except for her, at my table. Patty Murray jumps up, runs around, grabs my arm and says, "Amy, you just took the entire bowl of Thousand Island dressing and you're about to eat it." And I said, "That's what we do in Minnesota. We eat the Thousand Island dressing." But no one else helped me but her. You look at the healthcare debate that just happened. And I know my friend John McCain, I was so excited to hear that he is coming back to the Senate after the recess. And he got a lot of well-deserved attention for his speech, and then that big thumbs down on a bill that the president himself called mean, that would have cut over 20 million people off of insurance, despite the fact that, like so many in Iowa and my state, we want to see changes to the Affordable Care Act to make especially the exchanges more affordable. That was not the answer. But what get lost in it sometimes, yes, John took that vote, but right there were those two women Republicans, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, that joined all of the Democrats, and we had their back. So that's an example. So the other thing about this, I would say, is that women have persevered through time. And I give you some examples of this. Susan and Lisa, that example where they got so much heat from their own party and stood up and did the right thing. Or how about this one? Before Oprah was Oprah, she was fired from her job co-anchoring the 6 p.m. news in Baltimore. Love to know who that person is and what they're doing now. Before her series sold more than 450 million copies, J.K. Rowling's first Harry Potter book was rejected by 12 different publishers. Lisa Murkowski, who I just mentioned, lost the Republican Party nomination in 2010. But instead of giving up, she ran as a write-in candidate. And do you remember this? People had to spell the word Murkowski right or it didn't count. And she had these wristbands made, and those people in Alaska came in, and she literally got 100,000 Alaskans to physically write in her name, and she won. Okay, that is perseverance. For me, I will say, I got involved in all this in a persevering way. It was when my daughter was born. She was really sick. I wasn't in elected office. I was working at a law firm, and she couldn't swallow. And I was at the hospital with my husband, and they kicked me out of the hospital in 24 hours. She was in intensive care. I hadn't slept at all. They're trying to teach me all the stuff I'm supposed to do. We don't know if she's going to live or die, and they kicked me out. I went back to the legislature. I'd never testified before, and I went there as a mom and teamed up with a guy that happened to his wife as well, who was in the legislature, testified. That was when I learned, like, if you want to get something done in front of a nearly all-male committee, you just start talking about embarrassing things like episiotomies. And they're like, okay. And then we went to the conference committee, and the lesson I learned there was that while the bill to get a 48-hour hospital stay for new moms and their babies, we were one of the first states that passed that bill after I testified. People were trying to delay. Some of the lobbyists were trying to delay when it would take effect. So I found 6 pregnant friends, and I brought them to the conference committee. So they outnumbered the lobbyists 2-1. And when the legislators said, well, when should this take place? All of my pregnant friends raised their hand and said no. And not only did it pass, they moved up the effective date. So it took place the next day, and every one of those women got to take advantage of it. So that was how I got hooked on getting involved in politics. And so from there, I ended up running for county attorney in Hennepin, which, as you know, is our biggest county and biggest prosecutor's office. I supervised 400 people in that office, and I did that for 8 years. And then when Mark Dayton, who's now our governor, decided not to run for Senate again, I ran for Senate. And that was really interesting because we had never had a woman win a Senate seat. And we'd only had 2 women in Congress the whole time. And I know Iowa's had issues with this as well when I was running. And we'd had these 2 women run for Senate, and both of them had lost. And honestly, they were both incredibly well qualified. But a lot of the themes of their campaigns were, we need a woman in the job. And so all of our press was used to that, and they would always ask that question, do we need a... And I would say, sure we do, but I'm not just running. And this is what I remember I said. To this day, I don't really know what it means, but it would work with these guys in the room. I would say, well, I'm not just running because we want a woman in the office. I'm running as my background as a prosecutor and what I want to do in the United States Senate. And then I would say, and last time I checked, half of the voters are men. So if I just ran as being a woman, I wouldn't win. But all the guys would go, yeah. I really have never used that since. I'm just giving a weird tip that I used back then. But I was surprised at how many times I'd be asked by the media in meetings, well, can a woman really win? And I'd have to say, well, a woman won in Texas, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, a woman won in Arkansas. And I would just have to go through all of this, which doesn't happen anymore, but it's really quite amazing. So I don't want to dwell on all that, but would rather dwell on the future, because I think as we're looking at our politics today, the answer is don't get mad, right? Some people say don't get mad, get even, but I'd say don't get mad, get elected, all right? So that is this part of what I wanted to talk about. And the first thing is, for students especially, don't expect your first job in politics to be so glamorous. My first job in politics was working for Vice President Mondale. I was in college. I got a job as an intern. I thought I was going to write all these policy pieces. And instead, my job was to do the furniture inventory for every staff member that worked for the Vice President of the United States. And I had to crawl under the desk and write down the serial numbers. And I learned it took like 3 weeks. And I learned 2 things from that experience. One, the vice president was very honest. Nothing was missing. And secondly, take your job very seriously when you're an intern, because that was my first job in Washington, and this was my second. So there you go. I think another piece of this is to surround yourself by supportive people. You've got to be expected to be attacked here and there. You remember when the words were spoken about Senator Elizabeth Warren, my colleague. She was warned, she was given an explanation, nevertheless she persisted. Well, guess what? That's become a rallying cry all over the country, and 200 women in Minnesota had it tattooed on themselves one day. So there you go. Another example of like that, Todd Akin in 2012 accused my colleague Senator Claire McCaskill of being unladylike. Do you remember that? And Senator McCaskill told this audience, told an Iowa audience, that the traits needed to excel in leadership, to speak out, be strong, take charge, change the world, are traits she sees as very, very ladylike, and I agree. A favorite example of the women supporting each other and kind of standing up for yourself was actually the Finance Committee back when we were debating the Affordable Care Act. And Debbie Stabenow was on that committee, and it was sort of a not too exciting proceeding. It was on C-SPAN, a few people were watching. And one of our then Republican colleagues actually was talking about the Affordable Care Act. And he said, well, I don't know why you'd need maternity benefits in there. He said, I'd never need them. And Debbie looks up without missing a beat and looks at him and said, I bet your mother did. Okay. And we got them in there. The other thing, as I look at our students here, is just to be persistent. My first race for that county attorney job, I got outspent 2-1, but I went to 29 parades, 3,000 lawn signs we put up, and 75 pancake breakfasts, okay? And I won by less than, I think it was like 11 votes per precinct. Oh no, 2 votes actually. And I figured out that if I'd maybe done 60 pancake breakfasts, I wouldn't have won. So that is the kind of thing I think we need, and the excitement we need to move forward, and just remembering it's not easy, but in the end it's all worth it. So now I just want to speak a few minutes and then take some questions about what's been going on. I really have to reel back to election night when Al and I were going all around our state, and I got home at about midnight, and I knew it was going, from my perspective, very badly. And I got a text from my daughter, who was in college, her senior year, and she was at Hillary's party in New York. And I forgot that she was there all night. I just forgot about it. And I had this horrible mom guilt when I saw this text. And it's like 1 a.m. in New York, and the text says, "Mom, what should we do now?" And I wrote this like long text back. "You and your roommate, you need to leave now. This isn't going well. She's not going to speak. The subways are still running. You're staying at our friends, and you have class tomorrow." That's what I wrote. And she wrote back, "Mom, I mean our country." And that is literally the question that I think many of us have been asking every single day since then. And I told my daughter that night that our country has been through many tough times before: wars, injustice, discrimination, financial crises, deep-seated discord. But somehow we always come out on the other side. And I like to remind so many of my friends, some of which are marching and some of which are in watching TV and putting the blanket over their heads. Yes, we resist, but we also insist on a better way forward for our country, and that includes Democrats and Republicans. And I think there is no more important time to ask this question than right now, after what we saw last month: neo-Nazis, white supremacists wreaking havoc on one of our nation's cities, an innocent woman killed, 2 police officers who were just doing their jobs died. And the president, he said there are many sides to blame for what happened. Well, I don't think there are 2 sides to this. I think there is only one side to this, and it is the American side. And that is why I go back to why the Senate is such an important place to be right now. It is a place where compromises can be reached and have been reached and better be reached next month when we deal with the debt ceiling and the budget and all these things that have deadlines coming up. But it is also an emergency brake. So when they tried to take health care away from over 20 million people, 48 Senate Democrats from Joe Manchin to Bernie Sanders stood together and said no, joined by 3 courageous Republicans. No, we're not going to defund Planned Parenthood. We are not going to kick people off of Medicaid, and we won. And we did that by sticking together. When the president decided to take us out of the climate change agreement, leaving us with Nicaragua and Syria, our mayors in many of our country's cities, our business leaders at many of our companies, our governors in many of our states said, no, if he's not going to meet those climate goals, we will. That is what I'm talking about here. It's not just resisting, it's insisting on a better way forward. The Election Integrity Commission, when they tried to force states to turn over sensitive voter information, voting history, even social security numbers, state officials from both parties said no. So I believe personally, just so you know something I'm going to do when I get back, that we shouldn't make it harder for people to vote, right? We should be making it easier for people to vote, because in this time of great distrust, that's how, no matter how people vote, voting as an exercise is so important to our civic world here in the United States. Minnesota has, sorry about this year, Minnesota had the highest voter turnout. You know, whenever I talk before the election, I always go, we can't be beat by Iowa for voter turnout. We can't be beat by Wisconsin. So this last time, while Iowa was right up there, Minnesota had the highest voting turnout in the country. And I think that's what we should see everywhere, and that's why when I get back in a week or so, I'm introducing a bill that would automatically register eligible voters in the entire country when they turn 18. We should be making it easier for people to vote. And while we're at it, I think it would be nice to get rid of all that dark money out of our politics and get a constitutional amendment to turn back Citizens United. The other thing about this, and maybe we can do this on questions, but the work right now of the investigations that are going on, we're going to have hearings, we believe, next week in the Senate Judiciary Committee. You know there's been hearings in the Intelligence Committee, but my number one goal is to make sure that the special prosecutor is allowed to do his job and do what he needs to do and not get fired. So that has got to be a lot of the work that we do. But that's the emergency brake part. As I look at what else we should be doing for our country, I always believe we are living right now at a time where we can finally govern from opportunity and not just crisis like we had in the downturn. That this is a country that does its best when we make stuff, when we invent things, when we export to the world. Coming down here today and seeing those cornfields and thinking about our shared American scientist, Norman Borlaug, that Minnesota and Iowa kind of shared, but his statue is yours. And I think about that. I think about this innovation engine that we have in our two states. One of the things that I think we should be working on is really looking at our degrees and our education system and figuring out how we can have paths for students, no matter where they're at, no matter where they come from. Just so you know, my sister, she never graduated from high school. She had some issues, and she came down, guess where? To Iowa, and she got her GED here. She worked at a plant. She got a 2-year degree in Iowa, and then she went on to get 2 more years of school, graduated with a 4-year degree, and took the accounting exam in Iowa, and that year got the highest score in Iowa on her accounting exam. So that is a story. That is a story that you see replicated across the country. And when we have so many jobs, by the way, in the trades and welding and those things, we have to make sure that we have a balance of jobs and we make apprenticeships easier. Infrastructure, that was the first thing the president talked about when he got elected on election night, if everyone remembers that speech. That was what he talked about. So we would really like to work with him on this. You know, I live just a few blocks from where that bridge fell down on a beautiful summer day. And as I said that day, a bridge doesn't fall down in the middle of America, but it did. And we rebuilt that bridge in a year in Minnesota. And we put a bunch of money into infrastructure as a result of that. And just a few years ago, Minnesota got ranked the #1 state to do business in by MSNBC. And what they focused on was that we had put money in education and we put money in transportation. So I just think that this infrastructure issue is huge, as you know, as we try to get goods to market from the Midwest, and should be a major rallying cry for my party and going forward. Investing in jobs in America, putting incentives in place for jobs in America, and making sure that we do something smart with immigration reform. Sometimes people don't remember that 25% of our U.S. Nobel laureates were actually born in other countries. 70 of our Fortune 500 CEOs are from other countries, and we should not cut off the world's talent. We can be smart about security screenings. We can be smart about all those things. Because in the end, that kind of rhetoric produces a story like we had in Minnesota, where a family went out to dinner, parents and 2 kids. Guy walks by and says, "You 4 go home." Muslim family. You go home to where you came from. Little girl looks up at her mom and she says, "Mom, I don't want to go home. You said we could eat out to dinner tonight. I don't want to eat dinner at home." You think of the words of that innocent child. She only knows one home, and that's my state. And she only knows one country, and that's the United States of America. So when you hear all this mean rhetoric, remember that girl. Last thing I'd mention with this is just bringing costs down for families. I'm leading the bill on prescription drugs to bring drugs in from Canada. Actually, Bernie, who I know is at an obscure university somewhere in Iowa today, he and I talked before I spoke, and I told him I was going to mention our amendment. And I also have the same kind of bill with John McCain. We can see Canada from our porch from Minnesota, so we'd like to bring in those less expensive drugs from Canada. And I'll just end with this, tying this all together, that, as I said, this is about resisting and insisting on a better future. Day 2 after the inauguration, we had millions of people show up around the country. 26,000 people marched at the Iowa State Capitol. On day 3, 6,000 women signed up to run for office. On day 9, people spontaneously flocked to the airports, objecting to that refugee ban. On day 100, my favorite march, the March for Science, my favorite sign. What do we want? Science. When do we want it? After peer review. On day 186 came the health care vote. And you know, when you look at all this, there's something quite simple, and that is something that Walter Mondale once said. I saw it in the Carter Mondale Museum. I was the only one that went there looking for Mondale memorabilia in Georgia. Where's Joan's dress from the inauguration? But there was a sign, and it was the words that he spoke when their term was over. And at the time I wrote it down, it was a few years ago, and it seemed kind of simple, just like the Maya Angelou that you talked about, Tasha. It said this: "We told the truth. We obeyed the law. We kept the peace." Think of how simple those words were. We told the truth. We obeyed the law. We kept the peace. That is the minimum standard that Americans should expect from their government. But I would go even further. That when I looked out of that window today driving down here, I saw opportunity. And while the person in the White House may see darkness, I see light, right? And so I want you all to see this not as just a moment to overcome in our history. I want you to see this as an opportunity to show the world what America is really about, to show the United States what the Midwest and Minnesota and Iowa and our grassroots politics are all about, and to show the people in the state, by all of you coming out for this lecture on a beautiful night, that you care about the government and that you care about a better way, and that we're going to get there. So thank you very much. It was great to be here. Where do you want me to go? Okay, I'm going to move over there. Okay.
We have about 15 minutes or so for questions.
Maybe 20.
Maybe 20. See, she's been doing this all day. I'm trying to keep you on schedule.
I'm good.
Working with
I
Rosa.
don't have any other events.
I know. Okay. Well, she's just driving back tonight. So we're going to take questions. We have mics set up on both sides of the aisle. One of the things that we try to do with the Mary Louise Smith Chair is that we try to give preference to students to line up first. And so if our other members of the audience could please let students be the first to take questions. First, though, I want to thank Senator Klobuchar for not only her sharing her experiences with us, which are so common to women in politics, where they see a problem, like getting kicked out of the hospital after 24 hours after having a child. They see a problem and they do something about it that often leads to them running for office. And there's so many anecdotal stories of women doing that. But also for her inspirational words tonight, not only with passion, but I also appreciated your sense of humor. And so I think that is helpful as well. And that chart that you gave at the end of the speech, I think, is inspirational to all of us. And I told this to Rosa, I don't know if I've had time to tell it to you, but as a token of our appreciation for coming tonight, we do have a Plaza of Heroines in front of Carrie Chapman Catt Hall. We have 3,800 women honored there right now, and you will be among those honored in the Plaza of Heroines. After we finish with the questions and answers, there will be a public reception as well. And so again, I'm moving off the podium. I'm going to help monitor the microphone over there, and I'll turn it over to you. So thanks again.
Thank you. A little water here. I have a Marco Rubio moment. Okay. So I'm going to... I think so.
Oh, okay. I'm actually going to ask a question on behalf of one of the great students that was at my table. I won't name her and embarrass her, but we were talking about student government, and she said, my friend and I jokingly talked about running for student government president because they didn't know if there'd been one at Iowa State who was a woman. And the rest of us at the table said, don't say that jokingly, say it seriously. So what can you say to some of these students who think about it but think, I can't do it? How do they start?
Well, you first start with your friends, and you get people together and you say, I want to do this, and you got to make sure you want to do it, first of all. And you're not just doing it to get it on your resume. I think that's very important. By the way, that can happen in big-time politics as well, too. And then you just go for it. And I think so many times people get afraid of doing things like this because they think they're going to lose, right? But I use those examples of Oprah, right, and J.K. Rowling and all those things. A lot of people lose some before they win. And so that just can't be the overriding reason not to do it. If you don't want to do it, that's fine, but don't do it because you think you're just going to lose. I think that really holds back a lot of women, especially from running. I also think sometimes girls and women think they don't know enough to run, and there's been study after study about this. So like we once had a candidate said, well, trade's a really big issue where I am, so I don't think that I can run. And someone looked at her and said, really? Because guys just say, well, I own a Volvo, so I know about trade. So, you really have to. I know when I ran for Senate, I had been this county attorney, right, for 8 years, but I didn't know a lot of the national issues. But I knew that I could run things, and I knew that I wanted to do a good job for my state. And so I actually, every morning, I would get up, because I had my job as county attorney, and I would have 2 people come over, one of whom had worked in the Senate as a legislative director, and one who I knew from my work. And they would come over, for some reason, at I think it was 6:30 every morning, and I would go downstairs in my bathrobe, and my husband's like, why do you keep, I go, well, I just don't have time, because we had a young kid and everything. And so I would greet them, and we would go over issue by issue by issue, and we did it for 3 months. And by the time I announced, because I was like a lot of women, I didn't want to announce and then just go, hey, I'm good, and not be able to answer any of the questions. It just bugged me. I wanted to have a plan. So I took care of that issue by actually learning everything and doing it on my own time. So I wouldn't have wanted to get in with 1 day's notice. And I did it that way, and it worked. So I think you just have to get in that comfort zone where you feel like you know what you're doing. And then you got to do that first, to me. And then at the same time, you're getting together what you need to run. And luckily for student council, you don't need to raise money as much, I suppose. You got to put up some signs. But in a U.S. Senate campaign, you have to raise like $10 million. And someone remembered what I'd said here at another talk I gave. This was a true story. It was so hard for me to raise money nationally because I had not even been in Congress, and no one could pronounce my name or would answer my calls. And 1 month, right in August, about a year and 3 months before the election, I finally gave up calling anyone nationally for money. And I got all my old address books, and I called everyone I knew in my life, and I set what is still an all-time Senate record. I raised $17,000 from ex-boyfriends. And as my husband has pointed out, it is not an expanding base. I just tell that story because you just got to go with what you have, and then go from there.
Hello. First, I'd like to thank you for your speech today.
Thank you.
And then, secondly, for my question, I need a little bit of background for it. My younger sister is looking at colleges right now, and she's gone on a few college visits. And she said something to me that really broke my heart. She said, Evan, I don't want to be seen as a woman engineer. I want to be seen as an engineer. So my question is, what can we do? What can I do as a man? What can we all do to help inspire young women and show that they can strive to be what they want to be? And also, how can we do that without patronizing them and making them think, you're a woman engineer, not an engineer, or a woman senator, not just a senator?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think that gets at some of what I was talking about. And thank you for being a man breaking the glass ceiling and asking that question. That was very good. It gets a little bit, my first answer is Natasha, right, who's getting an ag major. Am I right about that? In the College of Ag. So you wonder what a woman going into science or ag or that kind of field looks like. You just saw her, okay? Because that's what Barbara Mikulski would say when they'd say, well, I don't know, they'd say to her, I don't think you quite look like a senator. And she'd go, this is what a senator looks like. And so I think that we just have to change that mentality by getting the numbers and getting more women in there. And how you do that? You do that in part by getting girls comfortable with science, technology, engineering, and math at a young age. You all know this in elementary school. You do this by how you make it easier for everyone to go into these fields by making student loans more affordable. That's why I support the bill, Elizabeth's bill, to refinance the student loans by bringing that money in from the Buffett rule, which would put us in a much better place and bring down the cost of college in many other ways. Then I think the other thing you need to do is to have workplaces that are open to hiring women. And a lot of this can be what the environment is like. Not everyone wants to go sit in a cubicle by themselves, and that's why I've seen a lot of computer places and other things in the Twin Cities that actually have open places where people go and they bring their laptops and they work, and it's much more communicative. My favorite story about this was one of our ag manufacturers, and you have some here as well. And I went and visited one plant, and they had a bunch of women there. They were promoting women, blah, blah, blah. Then I went to the other plant, and the guy was saying, we're really having trouble hiring. We don't have enough workers, which you know is a common problem in a lot of our rural plants. We don't have enough workers. I want more women here. And I'm in this cab with him, and I'm way up, and it's just the two of us. And I said, and this is in January, I go, well, have you ever considered that it's like really cold here? You don't have any heat in here? And he said, oh, the guys don't mind. The guys don't mind. I go, no, I just think it's really cold, and this other place wasn't so cold. Anyway, so I put on my Facebook page that I had visited both places and, you know, nice things. And then I get the comments, and there were 3 comments. One woman wrote in, my brother used to work there, but it got too cold. And so he left, and I called the guy. I'm like, guy, the environment matters if you want to hire people. So, you know, I think that is a funny story about it, but it's really trying to set up a workplace where people have mentors, where they're comfortable in that workplace, and also where it's easier to, whatever you go into, where you can afford it by, I'd love to see more apprenticeships, tax credits for employers to help pay off some of the loans of students. There's a bunch of things we should be doing to get ready for this new economy, but we're not going to get there if we leave out The Hidden Figures, my favorite movie that I thought should win the Oscar. All right.
Hi, Senator. I am an Iowa State student and a type 1 diabetic, and I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for showing leadership in demanding answers from the insulin companies back in early July. As you know, insulin prices have gone up 160%.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
3 times the amount.
Yeah, exactly. So I was just wondering if you'd ever heard anything back from them, and then also if there was anything besides the reimportation of drugs from Canada that can be done.
I was getting too bored in my own speech, so I didn't put all that in there. So, okay. So let me tell you what we need to do. First of all, and I said this on Trevor Noah the other day, one of our big problems here, honestly, is that the pharma companies basically own Washington. There is just way too much power there. And it stopped us. While there's some good bills, some are partisan, some are bipartisan, we never seem to get a vote on them. And that time has got to end because, as she pointed out, I think EpiPen got a lot of attention. My daughter carries an EpiPen, so I was right out on there. And it was an outrageous price increase, as you know, and the public pressure brought that price down and allowed for coupons and generics. Well, you know, you can't take every drug and start a social media campaign about it, right? 4 of the top 10 drugs in America, 4 of the top 10 drugs have gone up over 100% in just the last few years. So what we need, first of all, is to unleash the power, and I am leading this bill, and we are going to get an vote on this at some point, or I will, it's just been going on too long. 41 million seniors, you don't think they can get a bargain? We have to unleash the power of 41 million seniors and take up the ban get rid of the ban that stops them from negotiating under Medicare Part D. Okay, that's number one. And while you think, well, out there I'm not quite a senior, well, it'll help everyone because it'll bring the drug prices. 2, more competition. Canada, other countries with safe drugs. Maybe you could put a trigger if the drug prices go up so much. I have a bill with Mike Lee on this. Or if you don't have enough competitors, then you can bring in safe drugs from other countries. We do that with drug shortages. I think that would be an incentive for them to keep prices down in the U.S. Number 3, more generics. Senator Grassley and I have a bill that stops this practice called pay for delay. Which basically says, this is unbelievable, that big pharma companies can pay off generics to keep their products off the market. That is true. That's happening now, and we would save $3 billion over 10 years if we stop that for taxpayers and probably an equal amount for consumers. Those are just a few of the examples. I have more, but people should be demanding this left and right. It is 20% of our healthcare costs, nearly 20, when you include hospital pharma cost. And it has grown over the years, and it's just wrong. Okay. Okay.
Good evening, Senator. Thank you. I just want to ask, it's a policy question, but it affects women and families. So when do you think that we will see movement with policies such as equal pay for equal work, affordable high-quality childcare, and paid family leave that doesn't only affect women, but does affect men?
Okay, so I support those policies, and I think we're starting to see some of them in states, which, by the way, the laboratories of democracy is really important right now when we're seeing this stagnation, when I think we should be governing from opportunity. But there is growing support, I would say. First of all, under President Obama, as you all know, under President Obama, his first bill he signed into law with the Lilly Ledbetter Act, right? And that was really good. We have other bills that are out there that have some growing support. And then there's been a lot of talk, including from some people in the administration, about child care costs and work-family leave. But we don't want to have a bill that's just window dressing. We want to have a real bill that makes a difference. So I think that time will come. I can't give you an exact date right now, but I think that there is growing support for that. And as you know, Kirsten has worked hard on this issue, Patty Murray. There's a number of people that have been leading the way, especially some of the women senators. We can't be the only developed nation without a strong work-family leave policy. That makes no sense for the United States of America. Okay. Next.
Hello.
Okay.
So you talked about prescription drugs being lowered, the cost of that being lowered. What are your thoughts on mental health in the state of Iowa and Minnesota as well?
That's a really good question, only because something I didn't mention here was your great former Senator Tom Harkin, who has taken such a lead over the years on health care and mental health care and help for the disabled. And what I always loved about Tom is that his best friend in the United States Senate was Paul Wellstone. And as you know, we passed the Wellstone-Domenici mental health parity law a few years ago, something after Paul's death. And we continue with David Wellstone's help to work on getting that implemented in the right way. We did pass a bill with the Biden moonshot at the end of last year for cancer research. We passed a mental health bill that I think is going to be helpful for a lot of people in terms of getting treatment and the access that they need. But right now, I think, honestly, our goal is to hold our ground, make sure that we keep the mental health parity in place, pushing an administration that I hope will be open to this to continue the implementation of that, and making sure we don't lose ground because of funding. Because when you look at some of the cuts that have been proposed to health care, including what we just saw on Medicaid, which we fought and won, or you look at some of the other cuts across the board to the government, I think that should be a real big concern on the mental health front. Because as a former prosecutor, I know that many of our cases that we had in the office could have been prevented if people had been given the kind of mental health treatment that they needed. You see so many cases across the country, and I think it's just still one of the saddest things that we haven't taken on this illness that Paul, whose brother had so severely, and Paul would always talk about how their house was dark because no one wanted to face the stigma and admit that his brother Stephen had severe mental health problems. And he wanted to turn the lights on and get it out there. And I do think that that has changed a bit in our country, that there's been more discussions about it and more talk about mental health. I personally am taking on the eating disorder issue, which, by the way, here's a big women's issue. It is the anorexia is actually the #1 cause of death of any mental illness. But would you have guessed that? Maybe not. And there's been very hard to get coverage. So for years, we worked on this, and Tom Harkin had the bill, and he passed it on to me when he retired. And then I somehow was able to get some women Republicans on the bill, and last year we passed that bill. So it said that the mental health parity provisions apply for treatment in rehab and overnight treatment for eating disorders. So change takes a while, but change happens. And so we'll continue this fight in Paul's honor and taking the torch from Tom. Okay.
Hi, Senator. It seems like healthcare is the topic tonight, so I'm going to ask about healthcare. I work in a pharmacy, and today I talked to somebody who is worried about their child getting prescriptions and a trip to the doctor. And so it seems like we had a free clinic here in Ames. When Obamacare came about, we sort of lost that because people were able to afford health care with subsidies. And now they don't have that. So I guess my question is, we've been sort of dancing around this. If we could just sort of ask you, or I could ask you, would you support Medicare for all? Mm-hmm. And that's my question.
Right. I would love to see health care for all, and I think that is one way, and I know Bernie's been pushing on that, and there's a lot of us that want to look at that and see that as an option, but we want to see how it would work. Medicaid for all, actually, and looking at Medicaid and expanding Medicaid is another way. Public option is something that I strongly support under the existing health care bill. That I'm just looking at what we can pass with a Republican president and a Republicans controlling both houses right now. And the bottom line is that you can't pass a major bill like the Affordable Care Act and never make any changes to it. And I think the most immediate change that we want to see is making these exchanges more affordable. You've seen this in Iowa. Ideas out there that Senator Alexander and Senator Murray are working on in their committee, and we're going to get started right when we get back. We're meeting with a bunch of governors about this, and it's really serious. And as you know, the president has been throwing darts at Mitch McConnell, more than hardly any Democrats, in part because McConnell was willing to say, let's be pragmatic about this and see if we can make some changes. And those changes include something with reinsurance, something with cost sharing. These are bills that Tim Kaine and Jean Shaheen have worked on, as well as some Republicans. They're in the mix. I'd love to see something done on pharma. I think you're going to see a bunch of bills on Medicaid, Medicare expansion, some including for everyone, some going down to 55. And I think we just need to get all those ideas out there. And the public option for certain. I think a lot of the Democrats, including myself, got on a resolution for the public option. That's something that we would more easily fit right now into the Affordable Care Act. And so those are the things that we're working on. But for me, just having to see this repeal over and over again, and then finally have the American people see when they saw what this replacement was that kicked 20 million people off of health care, I think it had 18% or something like that. And you got to a point where something that I don't think anyone happened in politics, where about a month or two ago, a poll came out and it showed that Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act was more popular than the President of the United States. So that is what happened. So we are continuing to advocate for the strongest Affordable Care Act while clearly thinking ahead, as you point out, to these options that will make it better for everyone.
All right, well, we do need to end our questioning tonight, although the three young women that are students here Rose is going to help get answers to their questions on a personal level. I also wanted to remind you that we're having a public reception in the South Ballroom next door. Also, the bookstore ordered copies of Senator Klobuchar's, I think, 2015 book, The Next Door Senator.
No, the senator next door.
The
but that's
Senator
fine.
Next Door, okay. I knew I had the right
No,
components
no, it's
in the
fine.
wrong
It's
order.
good. I'd be really excited to sign my book again
Yeah,
since I've been
yeah.
signing a lot of Al's books for
Yeah,
my constituents.
yeah. So-
They feel bad about it, so they bring his book over for me to sign.
Well,
too.
actually,
Yeah, so that'll be good,
actually,
yeah.
our bookstore ordered copies of her book, and they're for sale out there. So
Okay.
again, let's give Senator Klobuchar another round
All
of
right.
applause.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Iowa.